going to start off. So can everybody tone down your little conversation and we'll get started again. Thanks.
Hey, George was my older brother, and he's 15 years older than I am. And he wasn't around a lot when I was in my early years because he was often at university. And I tended to avoid him because he always wanted to make me run. So naturally, I tried to find something else to do. But there's a couple of stories that would attest to his character that I heard about and witnessed. One was what Paul mentioned about him extending his stride. And my recollection of it was pretty much the same, except that I found him laying on the couch. And he was completely beaten up. And naturally, I was curious as to what had transpired. And he said that eventually I got out of him that he had a rope that he was using behind the vehicle because he read this article. And he found that he couldn't hold on to the rope. And as he was running, he broke his stride. So he had a vest on, and he thought it would be a good idea to tie the rope to the vest. And so he's running along, and as Paul mentioned, he started to lose his balance, and he started going like this, and the driver sped up. So he had lots of injuries from that brilliant move. But when he was living in Montreal, he told me a story. He was living in this apartment, and George being George, they didn't really do their dishes. What he would do was he'd pick his plate up and he'd lick it clean, and then flip it over on the table. Actually, it wasn't very hygienic. At the same apartment, they were sitting and they noticed the glint of glasses from the apartment building next to them, and they realized it was a woman using binoculars staring at their apartment. So what they did was they all got naked, snuck out onto the balcony, and then stood up. And actually the blinds went like this. Carol, his wife of 5 years, she was a smoker. How George married a smoker, I'm not quite sure, but he also told me a story where he had a bit to drink one night. And he got up in the middle of the night to go use the washroom. And so the lights were off. He didn't want to disturb his wife. And so he reaches down and feels for the top of the commode and feels the fur and lifts the top up and proceeds to do his business and goes back to bed. And in the morning, Carol got up and opened the closet and reached, put her fur-lined boots on. So I was not overly impressed. And he told me a story one time. He was dreaming. He was over at the Don's apartment, and a bunch of athletes were sleeping on the floor. And he was dreaming about a spider. And in the dream, he reaches up and he swings like this at the spider, and he proceeds to clock somebody who's right in the face, lying next to him. Imagine that in the middle of the night. In his later years, George's political views became a little right of the till of the hand. But his heart was far left of center. He was a very generous and giving person all of his life. When he told me that he'd written an email supporting George Bush, I knew that he'd gone too far. His passion was running, and has been attested to this legacy dinner, and I really appreciate everybody coming. And I love him very much, and sorry to see him go. Thank you.
Thanks, Milt. I'd like to ask our special guests, I'd like to give them the first And our first Hope special guest will be Les Besser because he's catching a ferry. He and his wife Susan are catching a ferry to Victoria. So Les, if you'd like to come up and share some experiences with George.
Although we Skyped quite frequently together in the last several years, the last time I saw George was in person was in 2001. He came down to see us in California and spent a couple of days during Christmas. And it was a great time. We enjoyed very much having him over. He was a very personable man, and my sister liked him also very much, and vice versa. He liked my sister. I met George back in 55 years ago or so, back in 1956, 1957. I was a fresh immigrant to Canada after escaping from Hungary, and George was 3 years older, and he acted like a big brother, took me under his wing and helped me a lot, and we did a lot of things together. I was a hurdler, he was a sprinter, so we didn't compete against each other very much, but we did have one race which I will always remember. I was very proud of him after hearing the accomplishment that he's done, and that was, we're going to Quebec City, and we were right there. There was a grass track. And we were both running the 400. They didn't have hurdles, so I was running against the great George Gluppe. And George had his father, his brother Don, and Milt also there, and he told me that he was going to impress everybody with his great run. So we ran the 400, took off, and he was 2 lanes to my right on the outside, so he had the stagger. He was already ahead of me. And when we got to half of the race at 200, he was, instead of the 7-meter stagger advantage, he was about 25 meters. And it was hopeless. I figured there's no way to catch him. And I noticed as we were getting into the second curve, he began to slow down. And at the beginning of the straight, the last 100, he was not moving that fast. So I figured this is the time to catch him. And I did. George was very mad at the end. Normally we shook hands and we didn't talk anymore that day. But we had a lot of great times together. But I have to admit something, that I'm a married man, and I never told this to anybody, so I'll share it with you. I slept with George once. It's not what you think. We were going to go down to Toronto. There was a track meet in Toronto, and in those days, the athletes didn't get the kind of money they're making today. We were watching very carefully to make sure we didn't lose our amateur status. So George and I were driving down in his Volkswagen. And we didn't have hotel money, so we slept in the Volkswagen. And the next day, I will never forget, I got up and I was so sore. And then we went to the track meet to run after that. We had many, many adventures. I don't have time to get into that. But one of them was memorable. The last year before I went down to college, we went to his home, took out the week. He had summer off, and I took a week off also. And we went to Hawkesbury to train. And Milt was telling me that it was a riverside, I wasn't remember, but we were running in the beach in the sand, and we were running 400s or 440s. And Jerry would say, okay, let's run 10 440s today. So we got to the 5th, the 6th, and I was dead tired. But I didn't want to admit it. And I was hoping he would say, well, let's just run 8 or 9. But no, we were always running 10. That's awful. Before, and again, I learned something today. I didn't realize that he had decathlon experience. At the end of the season in 1959, he went to our coach and he said, why don't we have a decathlon for all the runners? And sure, the coach said, fine. So we had a decathlon race and a decathlon competition. And the humiliating point for me was the pole vault. I don't know, how many of you tried pole vaulting? you have a pole that's about 12 feet long. It's very heavy. So you have to run full speed with that thing. And then at the end of the runway, you have to stick it into a little box in the ground that's about 6 inches wide and about a foot long. So you have to hit it right on. And then you have to swing up, and then you have to pull yourself, chin yourself up, and then go over the bar. Where for my case, the standing height or the starting height was 6 foot, and I did not clear that. However, now that I know what a great decathlon is, I don't feel so bad. Because he beat me only by about 110, 112 points. But the sneaky guy, he didn't tell me that he knew decathlon. Well, the years went by, and I will always want to remember this George. I witnessed his slowing down, and things were getting harder and harder for him. But I always want to remember this time when he was visiting us. It was wonderful, and he was a great friend, and I appreciated him. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much, Les. Now, if there's any other special guests that have traveled from a long way, would anybody like to come up? Bill Day is coming up. Thank you, Bill.
By the way, Les Besser is also a roommate of mine at the university.
We didn't speak together.
I'd like to say that this has been unbelievable for me. Everything that's been said about George is absolutely correct. I went to Michigan with him. I know all the little chicaneries we used to get involved with, and he was always pushing. Yes, we crashed that damn Volkswagen at least once when I was with him, and we survived because we hit the assistant track coach. Said, you guys are in trouble. George and I kind of separated many, many times in our running careers. One day he called me, he was living out here, he came in and said, is that you, fat ass? I said, what is it? He said, it's me, George. He said, what are you doing then? I'm running in the master's program. The master's program? I said, yeah, 5-year increments over 35, it's a lot of fun. So I said, well, what did you run today? Oh, I ran 100 meters. Well, what was your time? 15.5. I said, George, I can walk that fast. So he got me involved, as all of you said, only a George could do. You know, he was the type of person that would help anybody. Come on. So I went at it. So I ran for 2 years, didn't miss a day, and I called him up, and I said, George, I've made the team to go to England. He said, fine, I'll go with you. And he did. And we had a great time. 2 years later, I made the team to go to Australia. George came. I wasn't even close to making the semifinal. Look, I said, George, see these track shoes? They're done. He said, fine, let's go and have a drink. But so from there we went off and we spent 4 days in the Great Barrier Reef and had a great time with George. George was, in a way, an intricate part of my life. And all I want to say, George, thank you.
And thank you, Bill. Do I have my next volunteer? I think it's Andy Buckstein. Andy was a teammate of mine at George S. Henry, but he was a fast guy, 1 in 200 meters.
I stand here today and recognize I'm really standing here as a representative of many people that were George's athletes and fellow coaches back in Ontario. I first met George Gluppe in the fall of 1973 when I began attending George S. Henry Secondary School as a grade-headed student, and at that time I simply knew him as Mr. Gluppe, one of the phys ed teachers that were there. And I do recall running the odd race, 200 meters and 400 meters in junior high in the first couple of years of high school, but training was not my vocabulary then. I ran the odd meet, might have made the odd team and got promptly knocked out in the first elimination meet, which was the North York High School Championships. And then, as an aside, I must say that the only thing I really remember of George Gluppe in my first 2 years of high school was him teaching phys ed. And one day, when showed up at school, and it's been an incident that's been alluded to already twice today, saw George Gluppe, Mr. Gluppe, walking down the hall in what can only be described as the hobble of an 80-year-old man. And of course, that was the incident where he hooked himself up to this harness behind his vehicle. Now, the rumor going through the halls at George S. Henry was that his wife had tried to kill him. But if you actually spoke to George, and surprisingly, it hasn't come out yet today, but it was his wife, George told me, that was driving the car. And George had hooked himself up to a harness, as has been described, with the rope, had worked out with Carol in advance certain hand signals. I'm not sure exactly what they were in terms of what would you would think, faster, slower, stay, the same, but somehow the speed picked up on the car, he started motioning, she thought it meant faster, and down he went with a separated shoulder and all kinds of other injuries. The phrase that George often used was, "Can you believe that guy?" And he used that whenever he saw something he thought was particularly funny, an individual or a certain circumstance. And I'll come back to that phrase a little bit later, but I do digress. George Gluppe was an individual who had a profound effect on many people's lives. And when we first heard from Nancy that George had passed away, and I spoke to Tim Park and Margot Waltz, both of whom are here today, aside from the obvious, parents, grandparents, siblings, spouse, and your own children, who obviously have a huge impact on your life, George Gluppe would certainly be the one person in my life that had the greatest impact for myself. George he transcended everybody else in terms of the effect that he had on me. And a lot of that happened as a direct result of a conversation he and I had on June 5th, 1976. And I know the dates precisely. Then in grade 12, I had somewhat surprisingly, because I still wasn't training, but I had made our school's 4x400 meter relay team to go to the North York Championships, which we won. We qualified to go to the Ontario High School Championships, and somewhat surprisingly, everybody there, we actually made the final. Now, I was the slowest guy on the team. There's no doubt about that. And we made the final. We didn't medal. We didn't win. We didn't medal. We came sixth in the final. But I remember sitting in the stands with George Gluppe after that race, and he said to me, you know, if you actually trained for this sport, I think you might be pretty good. And so he told me that aside from the high school, that's all I knew him from at that point, he talked about this track club, the York University Track Club, and he encouraged me to come out and train with the track club. But what he said was, you know, don't expect immediate results. Give it a year, train solidly for a year, and I'll guarantee you that if you do that for a year, your times will improve significantly. Later that summer of 1976, I was up visiting my grandparents' cottage in Beaverton. And since I'm now standing in British Columbia, I have to clarify that's Beaverton, Ontario, not Beaverton, Oregon. And I was out for a training run. So yes, George was already having an influence on me. I was actually out for a training run. And some guy who I would simply describe as a smart aleck saw me out running one night and yelled, "Hey, you're going the wrong way. Montreal's that way." Of course, Montreal being host Olympics then. Well, little did he, that fellow, or myself know, but by the time the next Olympics rolled around 4 years later, I had been in 4 national championships and held an Ontario and Canadian record. For George's prediction did come true. About 10 months after I started training with him, my times dramatically improved and continued to do so for the 7 years that I continued to run from 76 to 83. And I recognized that any success that I had on the track was a direct result of that first conversation with George in June 76 and the training that he gave me as my coach. Last fall, I had the good fortune to be inducted into the Hall of Fame at the University of Windsor. While George couldn't be there, he certainly was spoken of by me in my induction remarks. For George had sparked a passion in me, not just with my own running, but a lifelong passion for all aspects of track and field. And as a result, I've seen many parts of this country and many countries in the world. Israel, France, Germany, Hungary, Austria, Turkey, Russia, Finland. that I have to say I probably would not have had the opportunity to do so but for George Gluppe. And after George's retirement as a teacher in Ontario, he moved here to British Columbia. And on several of his trips back, I look forward to arranging dinners and get-togethers with some of his fellow athletes and even some of the fellow coaches from high school and from the York University Track Club when he was there. And oftentimes we would talk about things that had happened. And there were two particularly favorite stories that George had experienced, and I had experienced with him, that I want to share with you now. And they involve two names that you're probably not that familiar with, but actually, in the show video show that Warren did, they flashed by on the screen very quickly. Ian McBride, who remains a good friend of mine to this day, and Wahid Ali. There was a picture of us at the Quaker Relays that was showing there a little while ago. Well, I was fortunate twice to travel with George to Fort Lauderdale, Florida for training camps over the Christmas, New Year's periods of 76, 77, and 77, 78. And I recall that George asked me the first time about going down with the high school teams, a couple of the athletes from the high school team from the York University Track Club to go down. And he mentioned that we would all be driving down together. We drive straight through. We don't sleep other than just in the back of the car. We'll rotate drivers, go all the way down. And I agreed to go. I thought it would be a fun thing to do. And it was only the day before we left that he then said, oh, by the way, my father is coming with me. So we kind of thought that was odd. You know, what was his dad going to do? He said, well, don't worry. I'll drop him off at the track first thing in the morning and pick him up late at night. The track he was referring to was the horse track. So down we went on December 23rd, 1976, driving through the night, 24 hours, with his father telling us the same jokes in Ontario, Michigan, through the Kentucky mountains, Georgia, and on into Florida. For George had neglected to mention that his dad was suffering from a bit of forgetfulness at that time. Of course, the fact his dad spilled milk on the carpet of the car within the first hour led to a particularly smelly drive on the way down. On arrival on Christmas Eve, you know, we're all kind of stiff after being in the car for that length of time. George said, we should all go for a run to get the kinks out. Ian McBride was one of the athletes on that trip. Like myself, a sprinter, we go out for this run. It was just to be 4 miles or so. And Ian, unfortunately, rolled over on his ankle quite severely and sprained his ankle badly. Clearly, he was not going to be participating in the 2-day workouts that were going to start the next morning. So the next morning we get up, Ian stays behind in the motel. Off we all go to Holiday Park, which George would proudly proclaim that's the home of Chris Everett, you know. There was a big sign there. And George remarking about Ian, can you believe that guy? Can't even get one full workout in. Upon returning to our motel for lunch, and just kind of hang around in the early part of the afternoon and stay out of the sun, no sign of Ian. We didn't know where he'd gone. Off we go later in the afternoon for our second workout at the Holiday Park. We have a long workout. We come back. It's now 6 o'clock. Still no sign of Ian McBride. We last saw him first thing in the morning. Don't know where he is. Well, about 6:45, Ian comes rolling in, looking very flushed indeed. Where had he gone? To the beach, where he promptly fell asleep. The problem was that dark-haired and light skin, Ian fell asleep in this position. And so he took off his shirt to show a very bright red chest with a pasty white imprint of a hand and an arm and hand across his chest. George couldn't stop laughing. Can you believe that guy? For the rest of the trip, Ian's name to George was either Red or Lobster. In the winter months, George would often take a bunch of his high school athletes and his club athletes down to what was then the only indoor track in Toronto, at the South Industries building on the grounds of the Canadian National Exhibition Stadium, affectionately known to all in track as the Pig Palace. And the reason it was called the Pig Palace is that that particular building housed all of the pigs during the Royal Winter Fair, and only after the pigs left when the fair was over was the building converted and the indoor track was put up. So you can imagine what it smelled like the first 4 to 6 weeks while it kind of got aired out after the pigs were in there. So there we were, beginning of January 1977, a collection of high school athletes had gone down there, including one Wahid Ali, whose picture was up here a while ago. His first ever trip to the track, indeed the first time he had ever seen an indoor track. His Wahid and his family had just emigrated to Canada from Pakistan. George had specifically recruited Wahid, saw him in the halls at Henry or in the gym at lunchtime, goofing around, whatever, and he kind of recognized something in him. He said, why don't you come out and run with us? I want you to be on the track team. He had no prior experience with it. But he said he would do it, And George had managed to scrounge up for him a pair of spikes for him to use for the workout. So we go down there, and George's instructions for the workout were to sit out the first part of the workout, which was going to be 4 times 800 meters. By the way, one of the things George instilled in me was to do training diaries. So I consulted the diaries to even see what the workouts were. And the second part of the workout, George said in a fairly cryptic fashion to Wahi and the rest of us, 6 times 200 at 90 with 100 jog. Wahi didn't know what that meant. So we told him we're going to run 6 200 meters at 90% speed, or roughly 90% speed, and we'll stop and jog 100 meters in between before starting the next one. So Wahi said, okay, he's fine to do that. So off we go, and I think there was a group of about 4 or 5 of us running that set of 200 meters. So off we go, and Wahi's trailing by a step or two the group. Until the end of the first 200, just before the end, Wahi kind of puts on a burst and comes up and pulls up even with us just as we hit the line. And the rest of us begin to slow down. All of a sudden, we hear this thump. And we look behind, and Wahi has collapsed in a heap on the finish line. Turns out, when you're giving instructions to somebody who's wearing spikes for the first time, what you should say is you're going to run the 200 meters and then decelerate into a jog, not stop, and then we'll jog 100 meters. So he simply planted his spikes on the ground with 2 inches behind, over he went, face plant. Of course, George, can you believe that guy? The really funny part, though, came later that night. George, and he was often generous this way, rather than having us resort to public transit to get back to our homes, he would drive us back up to our homes. So Wahi was the first one being dropped off that night. So Wahi tells him where he lives, particularly a small crescent, I think it was. We hit the crescent, and George says, okay, Wahi, tell me which is your house. We drive, going around the street. We get to the end of it, and George turns to Wahi, somewhat exasperated, and says, well, which house was it? He says, I don't recognize it in the dark. I've never seen it before. He had just come to Canada. He kept getting home late at night. We drive around the second time, and Wahi says, yeah, I think that's it. Door opens up, and he goes, first thing George said, can you believe that? Don't let first impressions, cause you to think, oh, Wahi. Within months, George had made him the Ontario High School 400-meter midget champion. I think probably everybody in this room knows what George and Nancy accomplished together. And I say together because it was George's coaching behind Nancy. But probably what few knew, except maybe hearing a little bit of it earlier today, was that when George first recruited Nancy to come out and run, she certainly wasn't then the outstanding athlete that she subsequently became. Indeed, and it's been remarked on already, and Nancy herself even talked about this, it was a well-respected track official by the name of Dave Hughes in Ontario, upon first seeing Nancy run at the Ontario High School Championships, said 2 things. Who is that girl that's running around like a chicken with her head cut off? And it's too bad that she had polio when she was younger. Of course, Nancy didn't have polio, and yes, her running style was a little bit unorthodox to begin with, but what she possessed was a steely determination that, coupled with George's coaching, led her to become one of Canada's top distance runners for many, many years. It's funny, really, but George and I came full circle. In the beginning, he was the coach advisor, and I was his student and athlete. In the end, and now speaking professionally, for I'm a lawyer, George became my client. So it was somewhat reversed that I was giving him the advice, and yet we both found the relationship, even though it had somewhat reversed, very easy and comfortable between us that way. In closing, I would simply like to say that George Gluppe had a tremendous effect on many of us. He believed in us, and we as athletes believed in him. And he, in turn, instilled a confidence in us and in our own abilities that went far beyond the track, the road, or the hills. While I'm sad that George is no longer with us, I am grateful. The last time I saw him, like Tim, I actually took the opportunity to thank him for that first conversation in June of 1976, and for all that he gave to me in his coaching and his expertise, for it has been profound in my life. Thank you.
Andy expressed that so well, not only for George as Henry athletes, but I think for all the athletes that he touched so deeply. And Andy, I was really impressed by your memory. That's incredible, and those Journals, I didn't start my training journals till after high school, so George forgot that part with me, or maybe I wasn't listening. I don't know. Charles, would you like to speak now? Okay, Charles Rybeck is going to come up next.
Okay, I have to add to this famous story. I wasn't planning on it, but my wife got a call about 10 o'clock at night, and she came back to bed and said, Carol just called me. George is in the hospital, and he's very badly hurt. So we drove up there, I don't know if it was the next day or the day after, and Carol took my wife aside. This was a woman-to-woman talk, and she said, you know, when we got to the hospital, George was embarrassed to say what happened to him. And so he told the nurse that he'd run off a cliff. This is pure George. And then he left me to explain where that cliff was in Toronto that he ran off of. I don't know where it was. But the reason actually I want to say some things is there is something I want to see. And I don't think it's going to happen. And it could have happened before, but looking back now, it probably wasn't possible at all. But it now is possible, and I hope I can encourage this thing to happen, something I very much want to see. Okay, so I was driving to my mother's birthday party, and my wife was taking messages from the phone machine, and it was all quiet. She just suddenly said, George is dead. And it's Nancy on the phone, and there's going to be a memorial. So I thought a bit about the George stories I knew, and the thing I realized was that I really didn't know him anywhere near as well as the folks who would be here. All the George stories really would be told. And that he had given my son a book, First at the Finish. It's a book he wrote. And it's a good book. And he had a dramatic talent. And there was a part of him that wanted to come out in writing and in art. But in that other form. And I knew him over the years that he had a novel he carried around with him, which went something like this. Young man, works extremely hard, pitfalls, setback, injuries, but makes the Canadian Olympic team, goes to Melbourne, beats Bobby Moore in the 100 and 200, and anchors Canada the 4x100 victory. If he really wanted to push his dramatic talent, in 56 he'd have the boy break his leg, not make the team, struggle hard, come back in 60, and beat Armin Hari in the 100-meter dash and Livio Berruti in the 200. Then the most amazing thing happened to this guy. All that dream disappeared, and he converted himself into a guy who just gave of himself. And this is when I met him. I am just this hack runner in Ann Arbor running around, and he comes up to me and says, "You look terrible. You belong on a program." And I can't imagine how many people he told that to. He told that to my wife's mother. But I have felt for a long time that Nancy and George together really form a large enough personality to be the major characters in a novel. I mean this sincerely, that this would be a great story to tell about all the stuff about running that doesn't really get told. It would be very interesting, these two disparate people who struggled. And I saw the disappointment in her when she came to Los Angeles in 1984 due to an injury on a road run before the Olympics. And then finally making it in 1988 in Seoul. But by then, George was 55. And to start writing then, to be a novelist, to get into this horrendous looking back and looking deep was probably too hard. But the woman who could write this story has a tremendously good heart, and she is very brilliant. And these, I think, are the ingredients of someone who could make a tremendous novelist. It's be a tremendous amount of work to do it, but it's something I would really like to read, all the ins and outs of what these last 35, 40 years have cost, and the achievements they would have felt. This would really be something to read. So anyway, thank you all very much, and thank you, Nancy. Without you, this wouldn't have happened, and it's a great gift to all of us. Thank you.
Thank you, Charles. I don't think it's true that a lot of us here know George better than you, because when I talk to Charles, I see parts of George that I feel I didn't know that well, even though I knew him well for such a long time. And I liked what you said about George having this artistic side. So, a lot to think about, you're right. It's very moving.
Only you can do it.
I thought I was going to get a rest after today. Okay.
Interval. It's an interval.
Would any of the other special guests from far away like to say something, or should we open the floor? Steve is going to come up. Steve Pimentel, also not a George S. Henry student. He has some good stories.
Well, it's going to be interesting for me because it's very interesting to hear the stories from everybody else here. My name is Steve, and I will say I will represent all the other North York schools. I didn't go to George S. Henry. But when I heard Andy speak, boy, did it remind me of my brother. He went to George Manning. And that's how he introduced George. Everybody was talking about George in North York. There were two defining stories about George. I went to a reunion of George Manning for people who had been running from 25 years ago. This was a year ago. And they were with their coach. And they were talking about George Gluppe. They were talking about Nancy. I think there are two defining moments about George. I think Nancy is one of them. I think my brother told me about how he coached Nancy and discovered her, and it was quite an amazing story from people from the outside. There was a reputation that was being formed. And I think the accident was a defining moment because I was told about that at Henry, and I think I responded that was the coolest story I ever heard. And I think that, created a lot of people to want to be around George as a result of it. And George is interesting. When I met George, I was told I wasn't a great runner. I had a very selfish reason to really use George. I was on George Maney. I was the sixth runner on the team. So that's the sub in my first year of running. But I really liked it. And then when you meet George, it is a 6 degrees of separation. All the coaches there have been touched by George. George Adams was my first coach. And when he discovered I went with George, he said to me, well, George is my mentor, right? So all the things he learned, I was being touched on. And so I thought that was very interesting. The thing is, my selfish reason was I didn't want to be the sixth guy. My brother was helping me get to the higher level of excellence. And he said there was only one guy in North York that could really make that, and that was George. And he said, all you have to do is go to the indoor track at York University. He'll be there. I met him. I went there. It was right near the end of the season. And there was George. And he looks exactly like the same picture. And I'll say to you, if you watch Lord of the Rings, you think of Gandalf. George is Gandalf. Okay, he had that humble look, the squinty eyes, round face. You put the hat on him. His staff was the watch. He looked an amazing character. And he had the magic, right? People believed him. He didn't say much, very quiet spoken, but he said a lot. And that says everything about him. And he had a big impact. It wasn't just in the results of running. He did the thing, he took me from the middle of the pack to the top 3 in North York 2 years later. I was thrilled. I remember going up to him profusely, thanking him. And he refused to accept any thank you. He said, no, you athletes do all the work. But now as a parent, I realized that's not exactly true. He had a huge part in that, and I would say it's more than 50%. He really was the guiding person. He really showed the values about hard work and being humble and not boastful and just doing the work and getting the results. Walk the talk. That was what George was about. And he had a huge, profound impact in my life. And how I treat my kids and friends and all the connections I have are a result of just going up to him that winter and asking him if I can join the York University Club. I talked to my older brother, and he's living in China right now, and I told him what happened with George. He sent me a note, and he said, one thing he remembers about George, and he had humor, we're talking about the humor, and he said, the cool thing about it was I saw the high school scene and I joined the club, and during that time there was a bit of a rivalry with Charlie Francis and all the Canadian sprinters were all joined at York University. So he said, the funny thing about George was that he described CNE. I think you were describing, Andy, the CNE grounds. And he said the entire Henry team was there 5 days a week. My brother would go down and hang out, and he actually knew George and was hanging around with them, and he was watching George. And George never said much, but he always shook his head, squinty eye shaking his head, and you heard him say, look at Charlie Francis. Look at those guys. He runs these guys like horses, like they're at a racetrack. Well, too bad he's got jackasses to train with. That was George. So if George were here today, I would be sitting down with him, and I would speak to him as a parent, and I would say, George, what you did to that guy, that 17-year-old, and helped him get to 18 and gain his confidence. I would say, you had a lot to do with that, and you have to accept the thank you and feel proud. And he gave back to us, and I always will remember him for the rest of my life. Thank you.
Thank you, Steve. All very well said. I know these speakers are kind of hard acts to follow. Who else would like to say something about George? Come on up. Hi, Diane. Diane Thomason saw George probably at quite a few Masters track and field meets. Long before that. Okay. Well, she'll tell the stories. I just couldn't see you from so far away. I recommend.
And actually, I'm wanting to speak today. When I said long ago, George and I were at a track meet in just outside of Montreal. It was called the Caledonia Highland Games, and we went there and raced on mud and grass. This would be with Myrtle Cook, coaching my first meet with Myrtle Cook. This would be about 1951, I guess. And at that same track meet was a man who became George's roommate in Michigan, Laird Sloan. And Laird and I stayed in touch with each other. We used to train down on the track in outside right by McGill, most stadium, right? And so the last time that I saw George was in 2009 at the Masters Championships in Kamloops, and Laird was there to compete. And George made a special attempt, although he was not well by that time, to get up to Kamloops to meet with Laird and for the two of them to have a good old times together. So I would like, first of all, to speak on behalf of Laird, who lives partly in Texas and partly on the East Coast, New Brunswick. I know he's with us in spirit today, and thinking about his very long time friend and the things that they did in Michigan. I connected with George again when I was running in Masters track, and he was too. But the other person that I did not realize knew George as well as he did until I was in touch with him myself was a Masters athlete from the very beginning, the CMITT, it was, Canadian Masters International Track Team. And one of the men on that very first Masters team that went to England was Cliff Hall. And I don't know if any of you remember Cliff or not. Nancy would, because he and his wife were very good friends with George and Nancy. Cliff, Sylvia? Was that her? No. Yeah, Sylvia. Cliff's wife has died now. He lives alone on Georgian Bay, and we're in touch. And he said, if you get there, please say a prayer for George on my behalf. So that's what I'm doing. Thanks, Nancy.
Thank you, Diane. In fact, Cliff phoned me just yesterday because he wanted to talk before the memorial, and he wanted everybody to know that he was here in spirit, and just a very loving man. He sent me many nice messages. Would anyone else like to come up? Don't be shy. John, you're coming up?
Yeah.
Okay.
I didn't say much before that.
You didn't get a chance.
Hey guys, so it's on wheels. So I only knew George maybe since 2007, so really only kind of five years or so. But he too, just in those 5 years, had a profound impact on my life and my running career, as it were. I joined Phoenix in 2007 and trained those guys, I think, for like 2 years. And every Tuesday night at the track with George's group, and Saturdays as well in the park. And actually that year, he basically helped me set 4 10K PBs over the course of 4 months. And the thing about George was he was, as it's been touched upon, he was very laid back, very cool. He was like the Fonz, you know. Hey, you know, he would just stay in the background. Dave Reed would be there at some of the sessions, you know, talking at a mile a minute, and George was just standing in the background, and then you just tell you know, you work out, and then just be there, go, you know, going through the belt. And yeah, he was just, he had that presence, and he had that understated sort of self-assuredness that you just believed in him. And I remember that I threw him to one side once and said, what do you think I could do? Seriously, how far do you think I could get? Just for me, you know, a very average athlete, but in the 10K, what could I do? And he always said to me, he thought I could do 33:30, which, as it stands, is still about 2.5 minutes quicker than I've run, but I came down by like 1.5 minutes in those 4 months. And I always believed kind of that I can get down to that 33:30 because George thought I could do it. And so I will, you know, keep trying and have that. And I think Warren and I were talking about we're gonna try and join up and together set some of those goals that George always said that we'd make. So thank you, George, for having that amazing impact that you had, and on myself, on everyone as well, whose lives you touched. Thanks very much.
Thank you, John. So John didn't know George until the last years of his life, but he still had that huge impact, and he still helped people believe in themselves. And I really hope we can get some of that Phoenix team spirit and speed back. I'd just like to read something from my mom and dad. George was such a big part of my life that he helped my younger brothers with their running too. My younger brothers were very talented athletically. My brother Mike, probably far more talented than me, but even more injury prone. So he didn't go too far after doing some great triathlons in his early 20s. But my parents recognized what George did for all of us, and they just wrote very briefly, "We will always remember George as an excellent coach and a true friend to all our children in their athletic endeavors. and as a loving and generous mentor to our grandson, Abidi. So, thanks for letting me share that with you. And my parents never knew anything about running really, or cared much about it. They always encouraged me just to do whatever I could be good at. And but they recognized excellence and they supported me in that, even though they didn't actually share my love of running. But for my brothers, I got the specific sport that when they saw me bringing home ribbons and trophies, they were really keen, and that lit a fire under their butts. So it ended up that we all got into running. And my other brother, Alan, is running really well now as a 51-year-old. Well, it's time to ask if anyone else would like to say something. Paul has a couple more stories he'd like to share. We have till 5 o'clock, so after Paul says a few more words, everybody's welcome, if there's any more food left, to hang around and socialize.
I had a couple more points to make before George so rudely interrupted me earlier. This story apparently happened near Hawkesbury on a trip away from Michigan, and he was with his old buddies. One of the people was a person that was in his elementary school classes and so on, and he was the type of person George could have so easily become. He worked his whole life in the mill, heavy drinker, non-athlete, and so on. So picture three of them driving down the road near Hawkesbury on the highway between Ottawa and Montreal, and they're laughing and talking, and George was the designated driver. The person in the passenger seat was inebriated. The person in the back seat, very, very inebriated. I'm not going to name any names here, in case they're here. Anyway, so the person in the back seat suddenly goes, "Hey, George, do you want to see a 4-minute mile?" And George goes, "How?" And then suddenly he looks in the mirror and he sees the doors open. And this guy's rolling down the highway. And yes, he did a 4-minute mile. Anyway, here's the irony of this, is that this gentleman, who was a lifelong alcoholic and non-athlete, is now alive and well in Hawkesbury, walking 10 miles a day. That he reformed himself. And, the ironies of life, right? He's still moving. Okay, now this is an important story because it shows George's strength of character, which I admire greatly about the man. He did not feel that he could coach distance athletes unless he actually experienced distance running. And let me just briefly explain how Nancy came to do the marathon. She was a gifted 5 and 10K runner, but you might remember that at the time, in '84, there was no 5 or 10K for women. There was only a 3,000 or a marathon. Two very different events. So Nancy talked with George and said, "Okay, we're not really that good at the 3,000, but maybe we'll try the marathon." And so Nancy was not built to be a marathoner. I mean, just look at her. Right? But she decided she'd give it a try. And like Nancy, she worked her butt off. And she trained with Anne-Marie Malone and did a lot of heavy marathon work. Now, George did not feel that he could rightfully train a marathon runner unless he tried one himself. Now, I don't know if there's any sprinters out there, 100-meter, 200-meter, 400-meter runners who've ever tried a marathon, but George tried it, right? And I believe that this thing that he did hurt him for the rest of his life because he said his knees never recovered from this. But he finished it. He never told me what time he did in this race, but he did finish it. So here's a sprinter who did a marathon. And his comment about it afterwards was, "Can you believe the guys who do this race? I can't even consider this a sport. Afterwards, even my beak hurt." So I admire George because he practiced what he preached, that he was as tough as nails when he had to be, and he was laid back all the other times. And he made him an outstanding coach. His great strength was looking into the heart of each person and seeing what their potential could be with proper growth and training, and then being the gardener that cultivated that potential in the person. And that is a very, very rare talent that very few coaches have. But George had it, and I repeat what I said before. Thank you, George, for 30 years of brutal pain and suffering that made me into a much better human being and helped thousands of other people become better human beings. Thank you, George.
It looks like Boris is itching to play us a tune, and I think he said he was going to end with some upbeat music here. So are you ready, Boris?
Well, we'll give
You
it
look
a try.
ready.
We'll give
All
it a
right,
try,
thank you.
yeah. It's very difficult to try and write a song about somebody who is so multifarious as George, like the eye of a fly or an eagle, 3,000 hexagonal units all being something different. So what I did was try to do an instrumental, and I finished one a week ago, and I just call it George, Run, Run, Run. I'll do it for you now. And I looked for a long time, and I just found this song to do before I left, so I have to look at the lyrics. George was into many things, and at the closing at the end before he passed, he was into philosophy. But I remember one thing, I just remember now. When we were coaching track together, there was one runner who had outstanding quality who was here today.
And that runner had a chance to go to Princeton in Georgia. He's going to be a big success someday. Well, George Jennings never went to Princeton, but he is a big success, and it is today. So George Jennings, you're another example of success. He has 2 companies, I understand, that are functioning here, one in environmental protection and an engineering company. So it's not only success in running that George was able to contribute to, it was success with individual people wherever they decided to direct themselves. So, looking at George, I found this song, and guess what? It's written by a guy who's 72 years old, Gordon Lightfoot. But I'd like you to do something in the chorus. Either clap your hands or stamp your feet, because the chorus is very uplifting. It talks about the future, it talks about growth, and talks about the fact that George found an answer to his quest, called the wherefore and the why. On the 30th, the morning after I come back. I have never seen one organized and directed and contributed to so well by all the people here, by Paul and all the other people, the video presentation, and Andy Buckstein and the comments of the various people who knew different aspects of George come together in such a picture. Thank you all.
And you are a huge part of it, Boris. Thanks for coming all the way from Toronto. This is